Why don't we start with this simple question? How do you think Israel has changed since October 7th?
First of all, it's a strange thing because in many ways we were living both a dream and a delusion, right? We were living in this notion that we didn't have neighbors, or that our neighbors were Europe or the United States of America. And, everybody talks about the conceptia. And by the way, sidebar, we also have to talk about the American conception, the misconceptions that the United States foreign policy had, that the foreign policy establishment had, that the European foreign policy establishment had. We'll put that aside right now. The part of the Israeli misconception was that you could protect people just with computers and just with a fancy border fence. And one of the things we've discovered is in many ways we've gone back to the old-fashioned Israel of the Ein Brera war, the war of no choice, where you need boots on the ground, and you need grit, and you need self-sacrifice, and you need nobility. So that's one of the major changes. The second is I was at the Nova Festival site, heartbreaking. 360 people killed there. But now the red anemones, the kalaniot, are blooming. And I heard people singing, Yom Huledet Sameach, happy birthday to you, singing to Almog Sarusi, who was turning 28 and kidnapped. And I went up to the son, to his younger brother, 23 years old. I said, what do you want? I said in Hebrew, what do you want from the Medina? What do you want from the country? What do you want from the Am? And he said one thing, and this gets to the answer. Achdut, achdut, achdut. We want unity, unity, unity. Don't go back to the divisions of October 6th. So we've learned some very sobering lessons, but we've also learned how much we need one another, how intertwined we are with one another. And I'm blessed. I don't need a therapist because I have 900 words in the Jerusalem Post every week to work out whatever issues I have. And just like you guys have sermons to work out whatever issues you have. And and then I've written elsewhere, I've written over 35 columns since October 7th. My favorite column was I endorsed somebody for prime minister. Idan Amedi. Idan Amedi, you may recognize if you've watched Fauda. He's one of the stars of Fauda. He's also an Israeli popular singer. And he could have spent the war, and it would have been holy work. Like David Broza has done over 100 impromptu concerts. And that's amazing because it gives chizuk, it gives morale. And Idan Amedi is younger and sexier, and it would have been even more amazing had he had gone from place to place singing. But he said, no, my place is with my chevra. And he's a combat engineer. And he went with the combat engineers. And unfortunately, he was wounded badly in Gaza and absorbed shrapnel in the chest and in the neck. But thank God he's okay. And before he went into the hospital and afterwards, he said one thing, achdut, achdut, achdut. He's from that generation, and we've learned that we cannot have the divisions that too many of our politicians from the left and from the right are fomenting. And so what we've seen in the country, that's what I was trying to say also from the Bima, there's a magic. We're together. And the challenge is we've shown that we know how to die together, unfortunately. We know how to fight together. But can we live together? That's our homework.
Yeah. Gil, thank you. Thank you for leaving your family and coming to be with us. It means a great deal to us, and we're deeply grateful to your family for lending you to us. We've heard from the Prime Minister from the beginning of this that this war has had two principal objectives: the destruction, or at least the complete military dismantling of Hamas, and the return of the hostages. But there's going to come a day, God willing, when both of those things will either be fulfilled or close enough. Then what? What is your guess is the thinking within the leadership of Israel of what happens next, the strategic vision for Gaza, for southern Israel, for Israel and Iran? What happens next?
What's so depressing about your question is that there's an assumption that the government has a strategic vision. And that's actually one of the things, right? It's scary. But the way I think about it is this. I think we're living in 3 time zones. We're living in today, The day after, and what did Bill Clinton remind us of in 1992? Don't stop thinking about tomorrow, right? And Zionists always have to think about tomorrow as well. Today, it really is about a clear war, a clear victory. And I was upset, by the way, I don't want to get too political, but I was upset when Netanyahu said at the beginning, we want to crush Hamas, we want to eliminate Hamas, I think was the language he used, and they started talking about we're going to catch this one and that one. I know how long it took America, with its resources, to find Osama bin Laden. I know you can't defeat an idea. And it's very important that we have very realistic war aims. So absolutely to free the hostages, absolutely, as you put it, you did a better job, I think, than some of our leaders, to degrade Hamas militarily. But you're right, wars can be lost after they've been won militarily if they're not won politically and diplomatically too. And so the first thing about the day after is that we need a buffer zone, and I'm sorry, I'm going to use an ugly, politically incorrect term, a kill zone of 1 kilometer around the Gaza border on their territory, because this is old-fashioned wartime. You attack me, I counterattack, I win, you pay in territory. And by the way, I think that's a language that the other side understands. So you start with that, with a buffer zone. And by the way, there's kind of an Israeli consensus about that. I asked a colleague of mine who's a pollster, he said, you're not even polling about it because it's sort of understood. I'm not trying to emphasize it too much. So in Gaza, Gaza's easy. That's the weird thing, right? Gaza's easy because in terms of Israel's immediate needs. Right. I have a cousin who lives on Kibbutz Nirim who was in a safe house, her room for 11 hours. It's a miracle she survived, Del Raymer. And she, even if she went back tomorrow, she's much safer. My son who's in Be'eri, I haven't lost a second of sleep worrying about him. They're safe there. Mm-hmm. So you have a buffer zone, you push back, you degrade militarily, and I think in Gaza you have to start thinking about clans. We Westerners impose our nationalist conceptions on the Palestinians. Mm-hmm. We forget the Palestinian people are still a people of Hamulas, of tribes, and so if you can find the clans that were crushed by Hamas, but don't have Israel do it. Have the Saudi Arabians come in. They don't want to have a force. Okay, let them work with the clans. Let the Canadians and the Norwegians and all the nice people of the world who've been foolishly spending all this money on UNRWA and wasting it, let them come and be smart for once and work with the locals. So in Gaza, that's the easy part of the question. The two parts of the question which are much harder are what happens with Hezbollah and what happens with Iran. And with Iran, I will get political. All of you have to stand up to the Democratic Party and whoever is in power afterwards and say the United States of America has to have zero tolerance for the way Iran is acting. They talk about, I've paid taxes in Canada, Israel, and the United States, so I can say we wherever I want. They talk about we Israelis as little Satan. Who's big Satan? You. 180 attacks, 180 attacks. 3 holy soldiers of yours, of ours, because they're defending Western civilization, killed by Iranian-backed militias. We have to have zero tolerance, and we need both the Republican and Democratic parties to understand that Iran is our enemy. And when it wasn't Israel, somebody attacked somebody somewhere in Syria this week. And, somebody got it, thank you. And Canada, right? Canada. and I'm sorry to say that our Secretary of Defense called it a reckless act. Let me tell you, Iran, they're a bunch of cowards because they know how weak their society is. They know that since the Iran-Iraq war, Iran has been very careful not to risk Iranian lives. They're very good at manipulating. And I believe that the United States pushed back with economic sanctions, as we were talking about, and cutting the oil pipeline, and pushing back, things would be different. So I think Iran is almost easier. The hardest piece is Hezbollah, because Hezbollah is very well trained and very well armed, but they also are Iranian puppets. So putting pressure on Iran would make a difference.
But why didn't Hezbollah attack on October 7th? If Hezbollah had launched 100,000 missiles at the north of Israel on October 7th, we'd be having a very different conversation. That seemed to have been a window, and they didn't want to take that step. How do you read that?
So I think a few things happened. First of all, in many ways, the attack plan that Hamas followed was a Hezbollah plan. Right. And we have a tendency, we foolishly clump the Arabs together, right? Just like they clump the Jews together, and we know how united we are. So never forget just think, they're as united as we are. And I think in many ways, Hamas outflanked them.
Yeah.
And then I think, as I said, that there was a quick mobilization. Why? And the same thing that happened Yom Kippur, 1973, the streets were empty. And so many more reservists got up north than they expected. And so it wasn't coordinated. And so where they might have been able to exploit the opportunity, they didn't on the ground. And why they didn't choose to release the missiles, we'll never know. I'm a historian. I want to know the facts before I speculate. And then I think it was very powerful what Joe Biden did when Joe Biden said, don't. And I have to say that as both an American and an Israeli, when the USS Gerald R. Ford came streaming down the Mediterranean, it was one of the great moments of my life. And I said thank you to you, but I also have to say we have to say thank you to the United States of America and thank you to this current administration for what it did then. So since then, the question is what's going on? And I think one thing that we overlook, because again, we're very focused on America, the Arabs, and Israel. That's the three parts. There's this other country called France. And France has invested very heavily in rebuilding Beirut and rebuilding Lebanon. And I understand that there's a lot of negotiation with the French because they don't want Israel to do to Beirut what it's done to Gaza. And I'm going to be very brutal here. One of the things that Israelis understand that I'm sorry to say most Americans don't, is that the theater of war, it's a good expression, is not just to stop Hamas, but part of the intensity Israeli response in Gaza is to let Hezbollah and the southern Lebanese and the French know what Beirut will look like if they cross red lines. And it's very important. On the other hand, we've seen that Hezbollah is pushing back and forth. And so where this cat and mouse game will end up, I don't know. But I know the more the United States of America continues to say don't, and the more the Democrats especially are willing to use that four-letter word, IRAN, Iran, and call out Iran, the safer the entire world will be.
So
I want you to know they don't clap for us. So
That's only because they have Hachnasat Orchim. They're just being nice. They're grading me on a curve because I'm a visitor, and they know, as you said, they know I miss my family. Especially this is a tough Shabbat to be away. You pick a random Shabbat, and all of a sudden it's a Shabbat where everybody's really nervous.
And your wife is home cleaning for Pesach, and you're on the road. God help you when you get home. Yeah.
My wife is home, and to be honest, we pulled out cash on Friday. I'm coming home with generators, solar power generators, because we're all thinking that if, God forbid, there is a God forbid, we'll have 2 weeks, because the first thing they're going to hit are the electrical infrastructure, the electrical grid. And let me tell you, one of the things I was thinking about, I asked a friend of mine in New York, so my last stop is New York, and I don't want to schlep things. I said, where can I go to, for camping, for urban camping? And 2 years ago, this is not exactly what you're asking about, but it's a sidebar, but it's important. 2 years ago, I know that if I had gone to, he said it was REI, right? He said, right? He said, go to REI. And I knew that 2 years ago, if I was going to REI, I would say, I'm coming from Israel. We need to consider what do I need for 2 weeks of urban camping? And I thought to myself, if I go in right now, will I tell him why or her why I'm doing it? Because it'll probably be a 20-something salesperson. And I just want to get the job done. I don't want to have a whole issue. It's not out of fear, it's just out of efficiency.
Well, if you go in
how could that be in my head?
If you go to Queens, it's probably an Israeli and you
Absolutely.
can speak Hebrew, so it'll be all right.
So let's talk about that for a second, because we were speaking about this before the Kabbalat Shabbat service. You visit with college students. You've traveled through. You've done a college tour. You're like an up and coming band in so many ways. Okay, you've done this college tour for the last week and a half, asking students what they feel, and in many ways you have a perceived diagnosis that's different than many of us who haven't visited college campuses, who haven't traveled around Canada and the United States in the way that you have, who isn't seen as a resource for Jewish college students. In your perception, what do you think is going on right now in this moment as a former college professor?
I'm going to answer small and then I'll go big. Very small. One of the things that most struck me was I was at the University of Chicago, sitting in an intimate space with 6 or 10 kids around a Chabad table. So they're the ones who show up, right? I'll get to the other ones who don't. But the ones who show up. And I started talking about some of the dilemmas of war. And they had no idea what I was talking about. I shared with them a very personal story of, I'm sorry to say, I'm trying to be careful with children in the room, but of a funeral I attended where a young man was told by his commander, injustifiably, to run from here to there. And because a building was standing, a sniper came and killed this 23-year-old who'd gotten married a month and a half earlier. What's the morality of war? Everybody's so careful to tell us about the morality of war. Shouldn't Israel have knocked down that tower beforehand? Had it done that, people would have said, oh my goodness, how dare you? The New York Times, which was yelling and screaming about Israel and its indiscriminate killings, this week had a whole thing about poor Shifa Hospital. And because Israel did such a surgical job and was so careful, not one civilian was killed. And they arrested 500 terrorists and killed 200 of them. What do they talk about? The poor buildings that were destroyed. Well, they were destroyed because they're not hospitals, but Hamas. They're not mosques, but Hamasks. They're not kindergartens, but killer gardens. But the fact that these very intelligent, engaged young people, the leaders of our future, didn't even understand the morality and the dilemmas and the complexity reminds me also of the fact that we now have a Congress that's filled with people who haven't served in the army. Michael Oren, the former U.S. ambassador to Israeli ambassador to the U.S., who did serve, whose father served in World War II, whose kids have served, says if you don't understand what it's like to go into a burning building and not know where they're going to pop up from the bottom or come, you can't understand the chaos of war. And so that's part of the reason I think that's a growing gap between the United States of America and Israel. And these are people who are really in it. Now when we step back and we see to the degree to which there's this mania, a mania, where this one small country is considered to be the source of all the trouble in the world. And our college kids we've raised them to be nice. We've raised them to fit in. And they're being told, you're evil. And what did we see on October 7th? The speed with which the attacks began on Israel. This is what decolonization looks like. And the celebration, while we know what was happening. I just say, how come no pro-Palestinians could go and just hold the hand of one of their Jewish friends or colleagues, or one of the Israeli friends or colleagues and say, wow, this must be a really difficult day for you. And then you want to start yelling and screaming about Israel's bombing campaign 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later, 4 weeks later. But why on October 7th? That showed that what's happening in college campuses, it's not about what Israel does, it's what Israel is. And it's not about whom you support, but who we are. And that's not politics, that's bigotry. And that's much bigger. And that's much scarier. And the fact that we're paying thousands and thousands of dollars for our kids to be propagandized, not just in anti-Israel, but in anti-Western ideas. It's an illiberal form of liberalism. It's a hijacking of liberal ideals. And we need a consumer revolution. What's going on in the United States of America, I'm sorry to say, and in Europe and college campuses is educational malpractice. And we have to learn that from our doctors. I'm sure we have some esteemed physicians in the room who do everything possible to avoid malpractice, not because they're afraid of the lawyers, but because they want to get it right. And we have lawyers who understand you don't want to have malpractice. So why don't we have educators who say malpractice is if I hijack the podium and turn it into a political platform, that's a violation of my job and a violation of the consumer code that we should have in universities. And we're not pushing back enough. It's not about getting rid of this college president or that college president. The rot runs much deeper. It's not that I have opinions on this matter.
So how would Jewish students respond? How do Jewish kids in college respond? How would we prepare Jewish kids differently for college tomorrow, knowing what they're walking into?
So the second half is much easier than the second half of the question is much easier than the first half of the question. We need what I call Pilates. We have to strengthen the core. If you come into the university understanding that the university of 2024 is not the university that we went to, but also understanding that it's not true in every single college and in every single department. We've got to be nimble. There's a difference between the sciences and the humanities. It breaks my heart because I'm from the humanities. There's a difference between often state schools and more of the elite Ivy schools. So don't come in loaded for bear. Don't assume that every college is a hostile environment, because then you sort of create a self-fulfilling prophecy. We need to teach our kids to be more nimble. But at the same time, if you have a strong sense of who you are, if you have a strong identity, and that's why it's amazing to me, because I'm from New York, as I said, so we assume that everybody goes to California to give up on their Jewish identity. No, so I'm serious, and to come here, to see a place like this where so many of you send your kids to Jewish day school. And we know, by the way, how expensive it is to be a Jew. That's a whole other issue. And it shows tremendous commitment. The more your kids come into the university, committed to not only to their Jewish identity, but to their true liberal identity, I mean lowercase l. I'm not talking about right wing or left wing. I'm talking about the liberal ideals, the Jeffersonian ideals, the Lockean ideals, the American ideals that made America America, and that helped the American Jewish community create this amazing miracle called not just the American Jewish community, but America itself, about respecting one another as individuals, not defining people by the color of their skin or by their politics. So we have to go back to those core ideals. But we also have to start partnering with our non-Jewish friends to say this educational malpractice problem, it's not just a problem for Jews. Has anybody seen, raise your hand if you have, has anybody seen an American flag waved at one pro-Palestinian rally? They hate America. And I'm not saying every Palestinian, but the people at those rallies. And did you hear that beautiful, beautiful new song or chant? Yemen, Yemen, make us proud, turn another ship around. There was a rally in Times Square supporting the Houthis as they're attacking America and attacking international traffic in the shipping lanes. So we need to partner more effectively with our non-Jewish friends. So we start with that, with a strong sense of identity. And then I have to say, I spoke to 3 groups of college students, and each time, pre-college students. I talked with 2 high schools in Chicago and 1 group of students in Jerusalem who are on their way, and each of them asked me the same question. In the Orthodox world, there are 2 universities in the United States of America. There's Yeshiva University and secular university. I just discovered that. So they said, do we go to Yeshiva University or secular university? And I said, look, everybody has to go on their own path. I'm not here to judge. But understand what you're doing as you make your choice. But most important of all, if we all give up on what they call secular university, if you stop going to UCLA and you stop going to USC and you stop going to Brandeis and you stop going, it'll only get worse. So our kids are in a bind because I don't want them to go. I want them to go to be students. I don't want them to go to be Jewish warriors. And one of the things we have to start doing is start creating centers of liberal education in each university, because that's doable. I think we often think too big. Let's create a new university. Do you know how long it takes to build a new university and build its reputation? And we all know how addicted we are to credentialism. I can certainly tell you as a Harvard graduate, the magic of the name. No, it's true. So, and the Jewish community, what do we ask our kids? As parents, as grandparents, as aunts and uncles, do we say, how's your soul? Which is what I always ask them. They say, no, what are you studying? Where are you going to school? How are you going to, right? So we also have to understand the messaging that we're giving our kids. But most important of all, we have to start building centers in each university of true liberal, democratic, critical thought.
I'd ask you to change the topic for just a quick second. Sure. Your book on Daniel Patrick Moynihan, tremendous piece of work. So I want to tap you.
I didn't hear that. Could you say that again? No,
yeah.
Sorry.
And it's available on Amazon for only $14.90.
Thank you.
So I want to tap your wisdom about diplomatic affairs, diplomatic history. The Economist magazine had a shocking cover about 3-4 weeks ago. It showed an Israeli flag in the wind, and the caption simply was "Israel alone." And Eretz Nehederet, which is the Saturday Night Live of Israel, had a very funny but often painful skit where they sang the song "We Are the World," but the lyrics were "B'li ha'olam anachnu beseder." Without the world, we'll be just fine. Can Israel make it alone? And when all this passes, God willing, again, when the war comes to some sort of resolution, can Israel rebuild its place politically, diplomatically, and economically in the world? Or are we fated to be Am Levadad? Are we fated to be a nation alone for quite a while?
This week we saw that Israel is graded on different standards, and by different standards, and you alluded to that from the Bima. We know that war is hell, right? That's the expression from General Sherman talking about the Civil War. We know about the fog of war. We know that George Washington in his first battle in Virginia killed other Virginians. Friendly fire, fog of war, mistakes of war. When the United States of America does it, they go, sorry. Bill Clinton, when he was just finishing his administration, was interviewed by Jan Wenner of Rolling Stone. And he said, yes, we make some mistakes because when you're dealing with tremendous power, you make mistakes sometimes, even the most sophisticated army. I just tweeted that out, and if it's on Twitter, it must be true. And how could it be that when Israel makes a mistake and takes responsibility for it, then all of a sudden it's evil? So we've always been graded on a curve, an unfair curve. We've always been graded unfairly. And I'm going to give you two answers. One is I have to say the post-October 7th Gil Troy said, we're going to do what we need to do to survive, and I'm going to stop apologizing. It's so clear. And I said that to my kids, your moral mission is to survive and to defend us. And I also realized, I'll go back, I've spent all these years coming to communities. I had the honor of being in conversation with you, pre-you. He was alive, but not in this community. Right. But he only became valuable once he was here. No. And I would come and say, yeah, Israel's really special, it's really fun, it's really wonderful. And I said, I'm not apologizing for Israel anymore. And I want my American Jewish brothers and sisters to stop apologizing for Israel. Because we're doing what we need to do in a war not only of Ein Be'era, but a war of clarity. So on the one hand, if we need to go it alone, we will. But what I don't really understand is why we are so alone. I understand it because I know that the New York Times has had 3,400 articles about Israel since October 7th. And during the 9-month campaign where the United States of America was fighting ISIL in Mosul, every single day the United States was involved, the New York Times had 80 articles, 3,400 versus 80. That's what we're talking about. And so there's a media mania going on, and we're in the thick of it. But I actually, as a political analyst, I don't understand why Joe Biden is so worried about Dearborn and about the far left progressives, who are the illiberal liberals, and doesn't understand that elections are won in the center. The fight for Joe Biden's reelection is going to be won in the center. It's not going to be won on the extremes. So I'm seeing a misreading of American politics. I'm certainly seeing a misreading of Iran, and I'm seeing a misreading of global dynamics. And if I were Joe Biden, would I want to go into an election campaign against Donald Trump with a catastrophe in Afghanistan, a stalemate in Ukraine, and a failure in Israel? His don't define his administration connected to Israel. So I'm a little confused about what's happening on the American side, and I think it's about weakness.
So let me flip Rabbi Feinstein's question the opposite way. I hope this isn't shocking for people. But in my heart, I actually don't doubt that Israel's going to be just fine. My question is, are we going to be okay? So if we have now funded we want Ukraine to fight just enough to lose over time. We are willing to stand behind Israel for 5 months, but 6 is too much. Taiwan is right around the corner. You don't have to be a genius to understand what's happening around the world. So the first person who told me this was somebody in the foreign ministry in the United Arab Emirates that said, a weak United States will lead to chaos all around the world. What should we do? Will we survive?
First, I want to speak to the kids in the room. I want every kid in the room, and All of you are kids. As a historian, right, because I don't just live in decades, I live, especially as a Jew, I don't just live in centuries, I live in thousands of years, in millennia and in eternity. I absolutely echo you. We will survive. We will be okay. We've faced much, much worse. We are the luckiest Jews in history because we have a Jewish state and we have one another. We are the luckiest Jews in history because we have this amazing thing called the American Jewish community. We are the luckiest Jews in history because we have this amazing resource called the American people. And I always say, God bless America, because we know that most Americans are for us, and most Americans are decent people, and most Americans are afraid of China and of Putin and of the evil forces in the world and have a very clear sense of right and wrong. So yes, we're in an awkward moment and we're worried, and you young people sense your parents' worry, but no, we will be okay and we will get over it, especially because we have the power of us. So that's half the answer. The other half is, at the same time, we have a moment in history, in American history, and it goes back to 9/11 even. If you think part of the reason why 9/11 happened was because at that time we were telegraphing a certain sense of failure. And Bill Clinton himself apologized for not going after Osama bin Laden during the 1990s. And we've seen the chaos after the Iraq War, and we've seen chaos again and again, and that's why I'm a lucky guy. I went to school when the only time we missed school was because of these things called snow days. I don't know if you have them in LA, right? There's nothing more delicious than a snow day. I see the Easterners coming, right? A snow, right? But think of how many days our kids have missed in their lifetimes because of Corona, because of catastrophe, and especially in Israel. So we're in a difficult moment, and it's all about leadership. It's all about vision. It's all about standing up. Go back to the 1970s. I don't care if you love him or hate him, but Ronald Reagan came in after the 1970s and said, we're not a sick society. We're not weak. And he stood tall, and he showed that the Soviet Union was a paper tiger. And it collapsed. Nobody believed it. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, Margaret Thatcher, Pope John Paul, and Ronald Reagan were the four nudniks in the world who thought, and they're left and right, so I can mix the two, theologians who said, it will fall. And they pushed back. And they pushed back on a bipartisan consensus because the Cold War was won by Republicans and Democrats not only working together, but understand that politics stop at the water's edge. When it comes to foreign policy, I may hate your position on domestic policies, but we're going to work together. So we need a real revolution in this country, because America is the power. And when America is strong, the whole world is ordered and in line. And when America telegraphs weakness and confusion and division, and we're so busy hating one another because you dare to vote this way or that way, forgetting who we are, the world explodes because the evil people exploit us.
I like your idea of we, that you're American, Canadian, and Israeli all at the same time. You pour first. So help us do this, because there is so much misunderstanding. What's one thing that American Jews need to know about Israelis? Not government, not policy, but Israelis and their lives, their hearts, their culture. And what's one thing that Israelis need to know about Americans?
A week after October 7th, I'm sure you all heard that at Cornell University, which is a university close to the Troy family, because we've had various my brothers, both my brothers served there. You see them.
They get paroled.
Went to school there, and one of my nephews went there, and there was a tweet saying, "You better close the kosher dining hall West 104." It was very specific, or else, and gave some details we don't need to go into. And what did the Cornell Jewish community do? They shut it down. They ran away. And I texted on our Jerusalem Troy family WhatsApp. I said, they hadn't yet found the kid who did it. I said, I could take this kid. And look at me, I'm not much of a physical specimen. I said, this is just a kid sort of jumping on. And it turned out it was a very troubled young man. And I wouldn't throw him in jail. I would just give him the mental health intervention he needs. But on our broader Troy WhatsApp of the aunts and uncles and cousins, I said, why didn't they invite the Cornell football team and the Cornell lacrosse team give them some free kosher steak, and say, we're keeping this place open because we fight back. And we turn to our non-Jewish friends when we're in distress, and we say, we're together. The new phrase in synagogue life and in school life is hardening the target. No. I call it broadening the target. If more of our non-Jewish friends wore that yellow pin that you have, if more of our non-Jewish friends, and this has happened before, right? We don't need to go back to Denmark in the 1940s. When Jews are under distress, our friends come out and they wear hostage tags or they put on Jewish stars because we are one. And it's unacceptable for a gay person or for a black person or for a Hispanic person or for a Jew in America to feel unsafe. And so I think Israelis are looking at American Jews and going, stop hiding, stop cowering, start fighting. And so I put this on my family WhatsApp in a smaller way. And one of my beloved sisters-in-law whom I love, she said, well, what do you want from them? They're only 18. I said, Cheryl, look at our 18-year-olds. But what is it? What was that moment showing? What's the messaging we're giving our kids and our grandkids? I learned in New York from my parents, and look, I was a nerd, but they told us that at a certain point, if some kid crosses the line, you push back. And yes, you fight back and we'll have your back. We need the fighting Jew as much as we need the accomplishing Jew. So I think Israelis are going to Americans and saying, we really appreciate your love and your support, but fight back here as well. And what do Israelis need to learn from American Jews? I've been saying this for a long, long time, that American Jews have this deep, deep understanding of the beauty and power of freedom and of individual rights. And as I said, one of the reasons why we score so high in the happiness index is we really have this power of usness, and I call it usness because it's a ness of us, right? It's a miracle. Ness in Hebrew is us, ness is a miracle, so usness is the miracle of us. And it's a collectivist society, but sometimes we miss some of the individualism. And I don't want to get too political, but there are certain forces in our government today who don't respect that power of the individual and the power of individual rights. And I think if Israelis learn that, there would be more of the back and forth. But I just want to add one other thing, because I just want to do hakarat tov. Because I walk into this amazing complex. First of all, my heart is broken. My heart is broken by those wonderful people you have defending you. I didn't grow up in a world. I grew up in New York, in Queens, in the 1970s. We didn't have guards. And I'm so appreciative of the guards, but so resentful that we need them. But I walk into this amazing campus. And when I speak to Israelis, young Israelis, and I say to them, I teach at the Hartman program, which has Israelis and Americans working together. I say, you've been here for a month or 2 months, 3 months. Every one of those institutions that your new American friends mention, the school they went to, the synagogue they worship in, the camp they go to, not one of them is built with 1 penny of government funding. They go, impossible. They say, where does the money come from? So I want to say to you, we Israelis could also learn, it's not about the October 7th stuff, but I just felt like you triggered this thought. You don't realize how generous you are. You take your generosity for granted. But it's actually an important value, and it's just part of what it means to be a Jew in America, is to just be generous and build these amazing institutions. And Israelis, for all their generosity of spirit and for all their sacrifice and for all they give to the country in other ways, are stunned when they realize this extraordinary infrastructure from coast to coast is built by you. So I just want to say thank you.
And Rabbi Leibowitz and I would like you to know that if anyone's feeling really generous tonight and would like to really make Professor Troy really, really happy,
right.
It's 818-788-6000. We'll find you.
As I was speaking, I wasn't sure if you were happy with this pitch or not. But you did a beautiful job of turning it around.
There's a pledge card under your napkin, and it has your name on it. And
this was unrehearsed.
Gil, I want to ask you a different question. I want the question on the other side, okay? We go to Israel, we visit Israel, we listen to Israeli music, we watch Fauda and Shtisel on TV. We read Haaretz, Times of Israel, and J-Post in the morning. but we still don't understand Israel. Tell us one thing about Israelis that we might not know, and tell Israel one thing about us that they might not know.
So first of all, by the way, I can't watch Fauda. I can't because my son was a commando in Duduvan,
Right.
and because television, Hollywood, is so good at making everybody sympathetic. It just
You all know what Duduvan is. Think of like special forces, Army Rangers, and then Green Berets, and then think of the guys even more elite than that, who call their parents and say, for the next 3 days, you're not going to be able to reach me on my phone. Don't worry. Which means that for 3 days, mom and dad don't sleep because that kid is going someplace where no Jewish kid is supposed to go, except that he's been highly trained and is surrounded by 24 other kids. That's the cost of defending the Jewish people in this hostile world. That's what Gil's talking about. Please.
and that's exactly it. I think
And call a kavod to your son for doing this.
I don't want to be critical, but when most American Jews come up to me and hear that my kids are serving in the army, they say, how long are they in for? Like it's a jail sentence. It's really interesting. And then when one of my cousins heard that before they were going into the army, my kids were going into this mechina program, these pre-army things, they go, oh, they're getting credit? Yeah. And when Israelis come up to me and hear that my kids are serving the army, they say, where are they serving? Efo, right? Where are they serving? And ha'im ze mashmouti? Is it a meaningful service?
Serious, yeah.
Right? Because not everything is glamorous. Sometimes it's not so pleasant.
Yeah.
So I think one of the things that American Jews have to understand is the gift of service. It's not just that they're giving back, but I'm telling you, I've seen it. The strength of character my kids have, which their academic father lacks, the experiences they've had, the maturity. My son who just got married, Yoni, has management experience because he was a katzin. He was an officer first of all, he was on the Gaza border for 2.5 years, 4 or 5 years ago. He knows what it is to be in a bureaucracy, and his dad, like most rabbis, only knows kind of, thank God, organizations which are much thinner and don't have that kind of multiple management bureaucracy, although this synagogue seems quite well run on many levels.
We have a
right?
lot of
You've learned.
Yeah, we know a lot about
Right.
bureaucracy.
But I'm a Luftmensch, so I look at my kids and what so it's not a punishment. It's a blessing.
Right.
It's a service. That's what Israelis can teach Americans, and especially American Jews, especially at this moment. And what Israelis could learn from American Jews, from their peers, is the sheer joy of learning. Because one of the things that's missing is that in the high school, at a certain point, you stop focusing so much on high school and you start thinking about the elite unit you're going to try to get into. And then you're in the army, and then you're out of the army, do the math, 18 plus 1 year in Mechina, 1 year in pre-army, and then 3 years in the army, or 5 years in the army, or 7 years in the army, you're already in your mid-20s. By the time you get to university, the university world that we know, that beautiful world, again, from our generation especially, where you just, Torah Lishma, you're just learning for the sake of learning. By the time they get to university, they're just, lashim V on it. They're just trying to put a V on it. They're trying to just get ahead because they're already enmeshed in relationships. They're already working. And so that beautiful gift. When I used to teach at McGill, I would get up for my opening lecture, and the first piece of homework I gave my students is to say, I want you to go back home today, and I want you to say thank you. Don't text, pick up the phone, or visit. Say thank you to the person who's most responsible for giving you this gift of having 3 or 4 years where you don't have to serve in the army, or you don't have to work full time, and you can simply learn in college. It's a reflection at McGill in Canada, in the United States, of the stability of this country. It's a reflection of what your parents or grandparents or somebody has done to make you be able to do that. And it's a great gift. And so I wish Israeli kids had that gift, but I wish American kids had the gift of service, the gift of giving back. And we didn't just rely on people who've never met to serve and defend this country. because it should be a joint effort and not just something we shove off to those people who aren't as sophisticated and enlightened and as well educated as we are.
So I'm going to use a question that Eric Kingsley suggested to me as an inspiration for this question. There are a lot of people, especially after the article I wrote this week in the Jerusalem Post, who said to me,
excellent article. I didn't hear that.
Thank you. I appreciate it. The article about moral clarity, okay, and winning this war at all costs. So there's two different paradigms that you could judge how maybe the war should end in terms of American reference. The first one is the way that we defeated Germany, which, by the way, Nazism is also an idea. We just managed to convince Germans that it wasn't worth their while anymore to put that uniform on. They were convinced through bombs that fell out of the sky. We also fought a very just war in the Civil War, where we decided not to crush the South, but bring them back into the Union. And we were engaged then in, 100 years of Reconstruction and civil rights and all kinds of rebuilding because they were never really on board, or one could argue they were never on board. I don't mean to judge anybody who's from the South in this room. Please don't write me an email. So my question to you is, when we imagine the end of the war in Gaza, with which reference point should we try to imagine as educated students of history? What are we looking at in Gaza? What is the end of the war? It feels like what other thing that we've studied?
Give him an A for American history. This is really.
Thank you, Eric.
Here's the problem. And I hate to use Holocaust and Nazi analogies, but Gaza needs a denazification. The Japanese went through a denazification. The Nazis went through a denazification. And that's the ideological battle that has to happen. But what's the difference between 1946 and whenever this ugly war ends? The world. Part of the reason why denazification worked was because the entire world after World War II came to a consensus that Nazism and Japanese fascism and totalitarianism is evil. And the inability of the world goes back to Moynihan and the 1975 Zionism as Racism Resolution. The inability of the world to recognize the evil of jihadism, of Islamism, and not Islam, but Islamism. The inability of the world to say, oh, Israel's on the right side, having endured what it endured on October 7th, and we don't have to go into details for any person in this room, means that even if Israel were able to achieve the perfect victory and the hostages were going to come home, which we pray for every day, and it's so moving to feel your love for them, and Gaza to be militarily defeated and the clans to come and for us to establish a new regime, because somehow Palestinianism has become the cause of the progressives. And they're illiberal liberals, not true liberals. They're regressive progressives. They're people who reason backwards when the whole progressive movement of John Dewey and Jane Addams and the Chicago School was to have certain values, of course, certain liberal values, but you start with facts on the ground and you reason forward, you don't reason backward. So because there are so many forces these days that say this is what decolonization looks like, and it looks pretty darn ugly to me, and pretty un-American to me. So if the whole world isn't with us, it becomes much harder to fight that ideological battle. And then it becomes much more about managing the problem rather than eliminating the problem. And the fear is, I was asked such a heartbreaking question by a young Toronto student who, like you VBS heroes, came to visit us in Israel a month ago. And he said, does this mean that just like every 10, 20 years we're going to have another war? And I try to be an optimist. But unless the world understands that the world has to change and the world has to stand up, we risk falling back into this again and again and again. But one thing that will never happen again is that we will never be caught just relying on video games to protect us And we're always going to have boots on the ground. And that'll make a difference, that we'll at least be able to protect ourselves even if we can't eliminate the problem. But we also have to emphasize that, I always say this about Jew hatred, and I always say this about the Palestinians' hatred of Israel. That's not my problem, that's their problem, right? I wouldn't want to trade souls with somebody who hates us so much that they could justify the horrors of October 7th. And we have sort of like an envy, oh, they're so popular. I don't care. You know, Henry Clay said, I'd rather be right than president. I'd rather be right than popular.
Well, let me probe that just a bit, okay? And I'm not advocating the progressive Palestinianism, as you put, but for that young Palestinian, let's call it young Palestinian man, if he looks into the world and sees no future, no hope, no possibility, and no dignity, his choice is to choose one of these messianic jihadi movements and blow himself up in an Israeli market. Does Israel have a role, along with the world, of creating a scenario in which that kid could hope for something, for some sort of future that might compete with the messianic dream of the jihadis?
Israelis,
in other words, does Israel have a role in preventing the radicalization of those Palestinians who aren't already radicalized?
It's a valid question, and look, here's the problem. Many Israelis, and part of my activism, one of the things that changed my life was the failure of Oslo, where I think that Israel really made an attempt. Just as it had made an attempt, you know, I say to my historian friends, I say, when in history have a people been attacked and in a war of self-defense, won territory and then given it back voluntarily? I know of 2 instances, and nobody's ever corrected me. And you're intelligent people, correct me if I'm wrong. In 1978-79, with the Camp David peace accords, Israel gave back territory to Egypt with the hope of peace, and that's more or less worked out. And in the Oslo peace process, Israel started withdrawing from major Palestinian centers of cities to reduce their footprint with the hope that there'd be some kind of peace process. And I think much of the Israeli left is still traumatized by that failure. And many Israelis are traumatized by that failure. So they said, we wanted to give them hope. And fundamentally, when I see who robs Palestinians of hope more, it's Hamas. Look at what happened. We withdrew from every single inch of territory. Arik Sharon said, from every grain of sand. And I've been to Gaza. I was in Gaza 2 weeks before the disengagement. They have a beautiful seacoast. They could have made it the Riviera, and they made it Hamasistan. And even today, everybody's talking about, you know, Chuck Schumer has created this new military doctrine that the role of a military is to fundamentally focus on preserving the civilians of the combatant, of the enemy. I want Joe Biden to call together all the Joint Chiefs of Staff and say, we have it's called the Schumer Doctrine, and I want the Pentagon to now focus on them, not on protecting soldiers, not on protecting American civilians. It's fascinating. But with all those tunnels, how come no Palestinian innocents are welcomed in the tunnels? How come no children are welcomed in the tunnels? So I think most of the robbing of hope and the robbing of possibility is from the Hamas side, from the Messianic side, and frankly also from the Palestinian Authority with its corruption.
Correct.
Nevertheless, it's important for me as a Zionist.
Right.
It's important for me as a dad. It's important for me as an Israeli citizen that we do everything possible for when that day comes, when they're open to it, that they feel there is a chance of hope.
Right.
And that's the thing that's missing sometimes from the discourse. We get so caught, and we're so caught in our trauma zone, and we're so hurt by the disappointments, and we're so hurt by the evil, that we don't also realize that if we just give a little bit of a rope, even if they don't take it, we've at least shown that we understand that we're open for that moment. And that's the failure of leadership. I spoke at AIPAC a couple of years ago, back when there was this thing called Policy Conference, Alav Shalom. And it really is a loss, I think, for the American Jewish community, dafka at this point. For sure. And it was during the John Kerry, Barack Obama peace initiative. And I said, I don't want Barack Obama running the peace train. And all my right-wing friends clapped with their one hand. And I don't want John Kerry running the peace train, and they all clapped with their one right hand. I said, I want us running the peace train. How come with all our startup nation and all our creativity, we can't think out of the box and figure out a way forward? And I think part of it is we haven't invested enough in making the kind of quality leaders. And that goes back to my love of Idan Amedi as an image. We need a new leadership. And by the way, these reservists, these young people, they're our heroes. They can create a new normal that isn't this insanity of left, right, and demonization. And maybe as a Zionist, I hope that we'll create a new politics in Israel that will inspire a new politics in the United States of America and in Canada and in the UK, which shows that you can have a politics where we disagree without being so disagreeable. And we love one another and we respect one another, even when you dare to think the wrong thing.
As our last question for tonight, because Gil is joining us tomorrow for services. For those of you who don't know, we have Shabbos services every Saturday morning at 10 o'clock. They're really lovely. We'd love for you to join. Gil, in this moment, we're sitting in April, 6 months. I'm just going to ask you about a couple of topics, and you can say optimistic or pessimistic. The return of the hostages.
Pessimistic. Pessimistic.
Pessimistic.
First of all, it was so beautiful that I hate to be negative, but you prayed for 134, and we all know that the numbers is lower.
Substantially lower.
Yeah.
Optimistic or pessimistic that Israel reaches a point where it declares victory in Gaza?
Optimistic, optimistic, optimistic. Key ein brera, because we have no choice.
Optimistic or pessimistic that there is a new set of elections on the horizon in Israel before the end of the war?
Desperate for it. I think we need a reset. I think you know, I don't care if you're one side of the, there's this fascinating, I'm sorry to not to answer, there's this fascinating anomaly in Israeli politics. 70% of Israelis have lost faith in the government, but 70% of Israelis support the way the government is running the war. And that's, I think, one of the things that the American administration and American people are missing, are not understanding. You could change Bibi Netanyahu with 5 or 10 or 15 other people, including Gantz, and they would be running the war more or less the same way. That's not the issue. But the issue is renewing the bond with the Israeli people, starting to be a little bit visionary about where we're going, thinking about the day after and using that word you use, strategy, and speaking to the Americans with just a little more respect and a little more cleverness.
Yeah.
So a lot, right?
Wow.
So I think that, and I'm not trying to get too partisan, but I think that but it wouldn't change the fundamentals of the war. So
the war's run by Gantz, Gallant, and Eisenkopf.
right,
That's why.
and by the way, that was the genius. One of the things that really saved Israel was creating a secure. And by the way, this is also a gap between America and Israel. I hear many Americans who are critical of Israel and critical of the way the war is going, blaming it on Smotrich and Ben Gvir.
No.
Right? Because it's Smotrich and Ben Gvir and Bibi. Oh my! And that's really fun to demonize. But while I have my criticisms of Smotrich and Ben Gvir, what's really fascinating and within Israel is since October 15th or 20th, nobody really pays attention to them. If you look at the amount of news coverage, they were churning up before October 6th and since, because it's now about Gallant and Gantz. And that was a very clever move. And I think we have to give Gantz credit, and we also have to give Bibi and Gallant credit for making that happen. Yeah. So there's a consensus. We tend to mix things. So there's a consensus about the war, but there isn't a consensus about the leadership. And whereas before I prefer not to have elections. I actually want like a bit of a Likud coup. This week in my Jerusalem Post column, I called on the 5 grown-ups, Nir Barkat and Avi Dichter and Yuli Edelstein and others who are established people, to say just sometimes, there's a reason why food has expiration dates. There's a reason why Americans have term limits. And for all the good that Bibi Netanyahu has done, and there has been some good over the years, at this point, after October 7th, and after all the toxicity, we need a reset. And again, I'm sorry to get partisan on a Friday night, but I think it's important to say that most Israelis want that 70% and that 70%. So most Americans think, if only we get rid of Bibi, then the world end. It's not true. But there might be a different framing, a different packaging, a different phrasing. And it's very hard to do that when you're stuck in your negative trauma zone.
All right, my last two, optimistic, pessimistic. Optimistic, pessimistic, the American-Israel alliance.
I have full faith in the American people. And I always start my analysis of the American-Israel relationship by saying three words: God bless America. And if we go back over decades and we look at the Gallup polls and we see how often there have been headlines in the New York Times going back to the 1980s, 1970s about the great rupture. Since Menachem Begin became prime minister, we've been reading about how American-Israel relations and American-Jewish relations with Israel are doomed. I could give you a stack of newspaper articles. But God bless America, the Gallup polls show that consistently 70 to 80% of Americans support us and agree with us and understand who we are, because we are fellow democracies. We are sister democracies. We have things in common. And don't forget that. And by the way, don't discount, I'm speaking to the Jews in the room, don't discount, don't disrespect your non-Jewish friends, but call them out to be as good as they are. We're letting them just sort of get away with things because we're just saying, okay, just be distracted by the Trump-Biden fight or by the latest Netflix. We need your help. We need to unite. We need to bring out, and by the way, in my experience, when I turned to my friend John Zucchi, an Italian Catholic, because we had an initiative at McGill I wanted 10% of the faculty in the first 24 hours of the BDS initiative just sign and say, no, this is unacceptable. And I said, will you join this petition? You know what he said to me? Thank you. He said, I watched this BDS thing happening and I didn't have the language. I didn't know what to do. You gave me a vehicle to show my love for Israel and my respect for the Jewish people. So I'm banking on the American people. But the great thing about being a historian is, and I don't want to disrespect the Bima, but I remember what James Baker, the Republican Secretary of State, said about Israel when there was a whole fight about loan guarantees. And he said something not very nice about the Jews. You can fill in the blank. They don't vote for us anyway. And lo and behold, 30 years later, the Republican Party is standing strong with Israel again and again. So I think the one continuity, the one dynamic, the thing we always know about America is there's always change. And I'm not willing to give up on the fundamentals of America, because I also understand that Americans understand. Who's close to America? Syria? Iran? The Palestinians? But who, when 290,000 Jews showed up on the mall? And by the way, I wish there had been 580,000 people, because I wish every single Jew had come with a non-Jewish date. And that was a failure. But when 290,000 Jews showed up on the mall, and one of my students, by the way, emails me, I never felt so alone in my life, because we should have brought non-Jews there too. But I saw how big that American flag was, because we Jews, we Americans, we Israelis, we are on the front lines in the fight for democracy, and the fight for freedom, and the fight for Western civilization. And that's why we're going to win. And that's why whatever issues we have now, we're going to prevail. Thank you.
I just want to thank Gil Troy for being here tonight. He'll be back tomorrow for services. I hope you're back tomorrow for services. I also wanted to take this very, very important opportunity in front of the entire congregation to wish Eileen and Dennis a happy anniversary. It's your anniversary tonight.
Yay.
And Eileen is with us. We wish Dennis was here as well. And Shelby, a happy birthday this weekend. She'll be spending all 3 days with Gil Troy. Dream come true. Happy birthday, Shelby. Have a wonderful night, everybody. Shabbat shalom.